So let's talk about the fear aspect. There are three main techniques that I want to discuss when it comes to creating something that provokes fear in the listener. The first one is very obvious, and that's discomfort. Anytime we create a sound that is uncomfortable, we can create a sense of dread or a sense of pain. So those sounds can be things that are either heavily distorted, which is very obvious, although I personally find that distortion is not necessarily the best technique unless there's some incorporation of anger as well. But then there's just simply sounds that are harsh to the ear, things that make us on edge. So if we go into this record, part of the record right here, we have this very high-pitched little ting noise that is really, really way up. And it's not something that we necessarily hear too much in the record, but it's painful to the ear to listen to. And the more we play that up, the more uncomfortable the record is going to become. So if I take an EQ and I hit that frequency that's way up there and just boost the living crud out of it, we end up with something that sounds like this. And I don't know about you, but every time I hear that very high-pitched sound, it kind of, like, I feel a tension in my neck. It's almost like I'm going like that subconsciously because it's almost painful to listen to. So with that boosted up,
your affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction.
it literally provokes discomfort in a very physical way. Now, the thing is, you got to be careful with this kind of a technique because you don't want to make somebody so uncomfortable listening to a record that they turn it off. But this is good for momentary discomfort. Now, another thing that provokes a sense of feeling tense, not necessarily discomfort, but feeling like you're on edge, which is not quite the same thing, is taking away resolution, making sure that the senses are not satisfied, that our musical, psychological perspective is not being satisfied when we hear the actual music itself or some sonic quality that resolves. So if we listen to this synth line, for example, you hear that it resolves on that last note every time it goes back to the key of the song, and it feels resolved. And when we hear it, it sounds like this.
Affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction. You're all.
So because it has that resolution quality to it, it feels dancey. It feels almost like a lullaby in a way, like a low-pitched version of a music box, which is a cool effect, and not something that I'm mad at because it lulls us in, right? It has a slightly hypnotic quality because we keep listening for and getting that resolved tone. However, if we were to take out the resolution tones and extend the note before it, which is a very unresolved tone, part of the reason why we like that resolution so much is because we get a lack of resolution, a tense note right before it that immediately resolves. It then sounds like this.
Our affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction. You're all caviar.
And I don't know if you caught that, if that translated to you the way it's translating to me, but to me that feels much, much more tense. It puts me on edge because I'm not getting that comforting resolution that my ear is psychologically looking for. A third technique we can use is to position things out of balance. For example, making a vocal uncomfortably close. A really great example of this is Billie Eilish, Bury a Friend. The vocal sounds more in your face than what we would ever consider to be pleasing in a record. A lot of rap vocals we position in your face, but we go in your face to the extent that they sound balanced within the speaker. With the Billie Eilish record, it sounds so uncomfortably close and right in your ear that it doesn't sound like it's even been mixed into the record. It feels like it's actually falling out of the record. And if I were to leave Elle's vocal like this, it would create a similar sense.
Your affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction. You're all caviar and friction, not a mirage, a calculated depiction.
So it almost feels unmixed, but remember, we're trying to provoke the opposite reaction here that most of the time we're trying to get. Usually with records, we're trying to get somebody involved. In this particular case, we're trying to get somebody to feel put off. So this technique can be really cool, it's really daring, and it very frequently does not work. So just keep that in mind. All right, now, the last technique that I want to talk about is one of my personal favorites, and that's taking advantage of something called the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley is a principle that if something appears to us as being human, that is normal. And if something appears to us as being not human, that is also normal. This is the psychological principle we use to distinguish between people and, say, our dogs, right? We look at a person, we go, that's a person. We look at a dog, we go, that's not a person. But there's an in-between area that creates a sense of the uncanny, sense of strangeness that provokes a fear reaction, and that's when something looks human but not quite right. And a great example of this is dolls, right? There's so many horror movies where we see dolls because dolls look human but not human. And so that sense goes, oh, something's wrong here. Something's off. So this idea can translate over to music in a really interesting way, particularly in sound design, where we can take something that sounds human and we can mix it and twist it around so that while it sounds human, it doesn't sound completely human. I'm going to show you a couple examples of that. First, I'm going to show you the counterexample where I mix something to sound specifically human.
Your affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction. You're all caviar and friction.
So maybe a hair thin on the vocal there, but it basically sounds like an accurate and natural representation of a voice with maybe a little bit of sweetening, right? So this would be a more typical pop treatment that I would do, and this is actually the treatment that I used on the mix that I did for the client because this is the direction they wanted to take things. But I want to show you what happens if we try a couple of different things. First, let's make something ghostly and washy.
Your affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction. You're all caviar and friction, not a mirage, a calculated.
I like this effect a lot because it provokes a feeling of strangeness. It's not necessarily complete, like, I'm afraid of this, but it's more like something just isn't quite right because there is this modulation that is existing that creates a voice that sounds almost like a voice should sound, but something's just a little bit off. And what I'm doing is using a chorusing effect here pretty dramatically that is creating that sense of there's some other voice kind of tucked in here. There's a pitch maneuvering that isn't quite right. Now I'm going to show you another example, and this is going to be a little bit more dramatic.
Your affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction. You're all caviar and friction.
That's a scary sound to me. It's creepy, and the reason it's creepy is because there is a second voice that's just whispering behind Elle's voice, and it's not a voice that sounds quite like a human being would sound because of the way it's been manipulated. And the manipulation process that I'm using here is called formant shifting. So if I solo this up and I turn this all the way, we hear this.
Your affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction.
So there's a lot of stuff in there that sounds human, but definitely doesn't sound human enough to not make you uncomfortable. And if you heard somebody start speaking to you with that voice, it would scare you. With this all the way up, in fact, I would say this goes from being creepy to being scary.
Your affection is an affliction.
That's gross, right? This is so weird. Now, if I tuck it behind so that we hear the main vocal and then we just hear that kind of supporting it.
Your affection is an affliction, an unpredictable factless fiction. You're all.
Especially the contrast between her very, like, pretty porcelain quality kind of voice mixed with this, like, unearthly, otherworldly, creepy I'm gonna murder you in your sleep type of voice. Those two things together create a contrast in the ideas that really emphasizes that uncanny valley. It deepens the uncanny valley, so to speak. And to me, that's just a really, really cool affect. And this is actually kind of the direction I probably would want to take this song, just because to me, it's more fun to listen to this way, the same way watching a horror movie is fun.